Please pray with me. Spirit of Easter, of life, great force that heals, that brings order from chaos, that's a part of every living thing. Minister to us, your people, we pray. May we know your presence. May we know your love, care, and keeping. May only truth be spoken and may only truth be heard, we ask. Amen. A big part of the spiritual journey is learning to look for the right things. Spirituality is not so much about possession, but awareness. Because what we think we're lacking, we seldom are. We just aren't aware of it. Last fall, I was up in Temagami visiting a buddy of mine, and he took me to visit a fellow named Doug. Doug's a fixture in Temagami. He knows every inch of the land. He's a trapper. He's got 2 trap lines. And we went on our ATVs back in the woods. And he started to show us things that we would never have been able to see. But once he showed us, we could see them. He showed us bear tracks. It was a big one, too. And I was just amazed at how big the paw print was. But I wouldn't have noticed it if he hadn't pointed it out to us. He showed us an area where they eat, where the fox and the lynx eat. And he took us another place and he showed us this huge rock. And behind it, down under it, is a hole where they nest, where they hang out. And it never gets snow. It never gets wet in there. And so because he was there as a guide to show us these things, we became aware of them. He showed us where the animals run through the forest, how they go places. I would never have seen it, but once he pointed it out, it made sense. And so the thing is, as spiritual beings, we see what we look for. And so we come here and worship. We want to look for Spirit. We want to see what she's up to. The ways that people reach out and sacrifice for each other, whether it's in the deaths in Nova Scotia or during this pandemic. We talk about Easter and seeing Spirit. Last Sunday was the largest telethon in Canadian history. 12 million viewers watched artists over the line share their music, and $8 million was raised for food banks. I heard this morning there's 500 people all over Canada who are crocheting large Afghan blankets for the families of all the victims in Nova Scotia. They're made up of squares of materials done in the colors of the Nova Scotia flag. Tedious work, but there's 500 people doing it. Sometimes when we see Spirit tracks and feel Spirit presence, our eyes really get opened and we're actually changed. We're blessed, we're encouraged, we're empowered. We sometimes realize we need to make changes and we need to be free from dark emotions. And that's what happened to the writer of our story today, the Apostle Paul. It's actually the earliest reference to the resurrection we have. It was written about 15 years before the Gospel of Mark, the first gospel. And Paul was like us. He never saw the physical Jesus. He'd never met Jesus. But he had a hate on for Jesus, because by that time the Jesus movement was proclaiming that it doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile or what you believe, it matters about how you love. And that drove him crazy. Because you know, white supremacists, Paul was a Jewish supremacist. And God was Jewish, and you had to do it that way or not at all. And so he was going around arresting Christians, having them killed. I mean, he was a nasty piece of work. But one day, on a journey to Damascus, to arrest some Christians, he had this experience of love come over him that he recognized as the risen Christ. And it melted his heart. And it got him in touch with how miserable he was, how angry he was, how lonely he was. And it transformed him. And it was the beginning of his transformation. It took some time. When you read his stuff, you see he had hang-ups about women and hang-ups about sex and different things. But you know, he reached the point in his journey where he got it. And he said, in this love, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither male nor female. There's neither slave nor free. We're all one. Wow. that Paul could come to that. It's a beautiful thing. And so he had that encounter with the power of Easter, the power of love. And there is this energy that can set us free. There is a presence that sets us free, that allows us to go past obstacles that have been robbing us of wisdom and of joy and of happiness. And if we'll give that sense and presence of love a real try, if we'll have faith in love and look with hope for signs of kindness and respect in our world, you'll find them, just like I saw those bear tracks I wouldn't have seen if I didn't have someone pointing them out to me. I mean, just think of the miracle of how life has evolved over 14 billion years. 14 billion years of energy taking shape. That divine mystery that ensures that life operates with exacting precision, even though we're in a universe of randomness. Those opposites come together. That's the magic. That's the magic. Even in the midst of chaos, the Easter power comes, and it turns out it can overcome evil with goodness. Paul says it's like a seed that's planted. It dies to what it was. Paul doesn't believe in a physical resurrection. Read that passage in chapter 15. He says, we die physically, we're raised spiritually. The physical cannot inherit the spiritual, he says. And so he says the plant dies, but then it becomes something new, a force that can sustain us and journey with us forever. There's just no power greater than the force of creation, than Easter power. But it's a vulnerable force, and we forget this. Love is vulnerable. There's no control with love. Love seeks. Love nurtures. Love melts. But love doesn't force. And God is vulnerable like us. God suffers with us. God cries with us. But God works through love to overturn what is wrong. God's love, although vulnerable, has the power to stop chaos and pain. I'm sorry. It doesn't have the power to stop chaos and pain. It has the power to mend it, to heal us, to give us new life and second chances. But with all pain and suffering, with all the bleak news that's offered to us nonstop, we can miss the spirit sightings and develop a negative story that holds little hope for the future. We need sometimes to be surprised, to be reminded that yes, life is good. Some years ago when my daughter Siobhan was 3, she was visiting her grandparents in Wallaceburg. When she left Aurelia, there was about 2 feet of snow in the ground. She was sleeping in the car when she arrived, and so we carried her off to bed for a good night's sleep. When she awoke, she immediately went to her aunt's place behind her grandparents' place, and she put on her snow boots, threw her coat over her shoulders, and went running out the back door with her mother trying to catch up to her. But then all of a sudden, Siobhan stopped in her tracks, looked down at her feet, and said, "Oh, Mommy, look, it's grass again." It was a magical moment for her because unlike us adults, who had been joking about the fact that winter would never end but knew it would, her 3-year-old mind assumed spring and grass would never come again. She hadn't developed what we call object permanence. She took it for granted that the grass would never again be felt underfoot. She was genuinely surprised by this rebirth of spring, by the Easter power which ensures that frozen ground gives way to fertile soil. You know, we're adults and we have object permanence, but sometimes we don't have faith permanence. Sometimes we get caught up in the pain and the negativity. Sometimes the hurts are too much. Sometimes we miss the Easter signs. I think it's sad that I'm hearing quite a few mental health professionals predict that when the pandemic is ended, there'll be a greatly increased rate of trauma in society. I don't know where they're speaking from, probably their own perceptions, because the hard evidence is to the contrary. A lot of studies were done on this very issue in New York City after 9/11. Yes, there were experiences of trauma, but not more than the norm. Most people, after 6 to 9 months, had worked through the tragedy and actually felt stronger and more resilient as a result. And we see that with refugees. My goodness. Are there any people in this world who have seen more horror, more death, who've suffered all manner of assaults coming and trying to find a home, and yet there again, their rates of trauma are no higher than the average? All those majority of refugees who've gone through hell and back work it through because the spirit of life and love is relentless. When we care for others, when we do our best to live in the love of Jesus, the Easter force flows through us. And the people who survive tragedy the best are the people who love the most, because that's what we've been created to do. We've been created to be channels of this Easter power of love. Last Sunday, I shared something of the life of an amazing woman, Lisa, who was murdered in Nova Scotia. And I mentioned how she and her family are all people of faith. Since then, I received an email that blew me away and reduced me to tears. The email was from her sister, who will be raising Lisa's children. She was at Lisa's house and went out the back to the beach. And there she had a glass of wine. She had a time of reflection. She had a time of prayer. She had a time of communion with God. She took 3 sips of wine, and between each sip, she offered a prayer. After the first sip, she said, "I pray that I can forgive my sister's murderer." After the second sip, she said, "I pray that my sister can forgive him." And after the third sip, she said, "I pray that he can forgive himself." I have no explanation for why people in the midst of the worst that they could ever imagine are able to move toward that kind of a prayer rather than being stuck in anger and retribution and depression and fear. It's Easter power. In the midst of the pain and suffering, the Easter presence of love comes and draws wisdom from our souls and moves us toward healing and frees us from all those dark emotions. Oh, the emotions come over us, the dark ones. But Easter frees us, takes us out of the tomb as many times as those emotions try and put us in. It's the stuff miracles are made of. It's the stuff you and I and all of creation are made of. And that's why Paul summed up Easter this way. "Oh, death, where's your victory? Oh, grave, where's your sting? Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." And so, my friends, the future is bright. Easter power is life. Easter power is love. And the signs are everywhere.